He said he was cold, but the moment he touched me, the entire room ignited. I first noticed her across the cafe, standing by the window as the late afternoon sun cut through the chill outside. There was a quiet confidence in the way she shifted her weight, the subtle tilt of her head as she examined the books on the shelf. I told myself I was here just for coffee, yet my attention kept straying toward her. If you like my story, then subscribe my channel. I approached the counter, pretending to study the menu, but I could still feel her presence. She turned slightly, and for a moment our eyes met, a fleeting acknowledgement, yet something in that gaze lingered. She smiled politely, and it wasn't just a casual smile. It held a warmth that contrasted sharply with the coldness I had jokingly claimed in my own mind. "I'm always cold," I muttered when the barista handed me my cup, half to myself, half hoping someone would comment. She did, in the most effortless way. "Cold people often just need the right warmth around them," she said softly, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. Her voice was calm, melodic, and somehow it reached past my defenses. I felt an almost imperceptible shiver, though I was dressed warmly. Something about her presence stirred a reaction I wasn't expecting. We found ourselves in the same seating area. I sat a few tables away, trying not to seem intrusive, yet noticing every small gesture, the tilt of her shoulder as she reached for her coffee, the quiet laugh she let out at something on her phone. At one point, our hands brushed accidentally while reaching for the sugar jar. The contact was brief, almost laughably mundane, but in that instant, the chill I had boasted about evaporated. The warmth of her touch lingered, spreading in a subtle, undeniable way through my chest. Our conversation began naturally. She asked about my work, and I found myself answering more honestly than I usually would, as if her presence coaxed the guarded part of me into openness. There was an ease in her listening, a patience that made my own words feel lighter. I caught myself noticing the small details, the way her eyes reflected the fading sunlight, the soft cadence of her laugh, the understated elegance in her gestures. She wasn't flaunting anything, yet there was a gravity in her presence, a magnetic pull I couldn't resist. As I left the cafe later, I felt a quiet astonishment at how someone could disrupt the very idea I had of myself. Cold. Detached. Aloof. All of that seemed absurd in light of the subtle fire that had ignited with her simple touch, her quiet smile, her effortless warmth. I knew, in a way that was hard to articulate, that I would find a reason to see her again. And somewhere deep inside, I hoped she felt it too. The next time I saw her wasn't planned. I had convinced myself it was a coincidence, a mutual friends book club meeting she attended. But the moment I walked into the room and caught her smile, that quiet, graceful smile that seemed to hold a world of understanding, I felt my chest tighten in a way that surprised me. She had a presence that made the mundane feel significant, and suddenly, even the ordinary room seemed charged with something unspoken. We gravitated toward each other naturally, sitting across the table. Our conversation began cautiously, light touches of humor, shared observations about the books, the weather, the way the sunlight played across the wooden floor. And yet, beneath it, there was a subtle tension, a quiet electricity either of us acknowledged outright. As we laughed at a particularly absurd plot twist, our hands brushed while reaching for the same note on the table. It was nothing dramatic, just fingers grazing, but it lingered in my mind far longer than it should have. The warmth of her hand seemed to seep through me, stirring a sensation I wasn't used to. I reminded myself she was just a woman I liked talking to, yet every subtle gesture, every fleeting smile, told me otherwise. She leaned forward slightly to emphasize a point, and I caught a faint scent, something floral, soft, familiar, that made my thoughts falter for a heartbeat. Her eyes sparkled with amusement as she caught me staring, and I quickly looked away, trying to hide the sudden, unanticipated flutter in my chest. Even now, I wasn't certain if she noticed the effect she had on me, or if she was simply as aware of it as I was. Later, as the meeting ended, she offered to walk with me to the nearby cafe down the street. The cold evening air brushed against our faces, and I noticed how she pulled her coat closer, how the scarf she wore framed her face in a soft, effortless elegance. Our conversation drifted naturally from books to more personal stories, childhood memories, small regrets, moments of quiet triumph. There was an intimacy to the shared silences, a gentle understanding that seemed to bridge the gap between us without words. At one point, I reached out to steady her as she stepped over a puddle, my hand brushing against hers once again. The warmth from that contact lingered long after, echoing in a way that made the chill of the evening irrelevant. She didn't pull away, she met my eyes briefly, and in that instant, a silent acknowledgement passed between us. By the time we parted, I was acutely aware of how much I was drawn to her presence. The age difference, which I had thought might matter, didn't enter my mind. It was irrelevant in the quiet intensity of these small moments. Something was growing between us, subtle yet undeniable, a spark of connection that neither distance nor hesitation could ignore. And deep down, I knew that this was only the beginning. It was one of those rainy evenings where the city seemed softened, blurred by the steady drizzle and the gentle hum of streetlights reflecting off wet pavements. I found her under the small awning of a bookstore, her umbrella barely covering both of us. The space between us was small, just enough to notice how close we were without acknowledging it outright. The air was damp and cool, but she radiated a quiet warmth that made my own coldness feel absurdly inadequate. We started walking side by side, umbrellas overlapping just enough for accidental brushes of hands and shoulders. Each contact, however minor, seemed amplified. The light brush of her sleeve against my wrist sent a current up my arm, making me acutely aware of the subtle tension building between us. I realized then that the cold I often joked about had nothing to do with temperature. I had never felt this kind of heat, quiet, intimate, electric. At one point, she slipped slightly on a slick patch of sidewalk, and my instinct was immediate. My hand reached out, fingers brushing against hers as I steadied her. The contact lingered just a second too long, long enough for the warmth of her skin to imprint itself on mine. I felt her pulse through that brief connection, rapid yet steady, and I couldn't look away. Her eyes met mine, not with alarm, but with a softness that mirrored the fluttering I felt in my chest. For a moment, everything else, the rain, the city, the world, fell away. It was just us, a private universe held in a touch and a glance. We walked on in a silence that was heavy with unspoken words, the kind that only grows between two people on the edge of something they cannot yet define. I noticed how she adjusted her scarf, the way her hair stuck to her damp cheeks, the subtle way her lips parted when she breathed, small details that made her human, approachable, yet infinitely magnetic. Every movement she made drew my attention, my thoughts, my warmth, despite my repeated insistence that I was cold. Finally, we reached a small cafe to escape the rain. She pulled her umbrella inside, and as we shook off the droplets, our fingers touched again, this time intentionally. She didn't pull away. Her gaze lingered, inviting, almost daring me to acknowledge the unspoken tension. The moment stretched, fragile yet undeniable, filled with anticipation and hesitation. I felt the quiet thrill of closeness, the way a simple touch could ignite emotions I had long kept dormant. As we sat across from each other, I was acutely aware of every subtle gesture, her hand brushing against the mug, the tilt of her shoulder, the way her eyes occasionally caught mine before darting away. There was a rhythm to it, a dance of proximity and restraint, and it thrilled me in a way I could barely name. The world outside could storm, drizzle, or freeze. In that small cafe, warmed by her presence, I was anything but cold. By the time we parted that night, I knew something had changed. The touches, the glances, the shared warmth of that evening had created a memory I would return to endlessly. It wasn't just attraction anymore. It was a recognition that some connections, subtle yet intense, could set even the coldest of hearts on fire. A few days after that rainy evening, she invited me to a quiet corner of her favorite park, a place she said helped her think. The air was crisp, the early evening light softening the edges of the city skyline, and for the first time, I noticed how her presence could make an ordinary setting feel intimate. We walked side by side, our steps unhurried, either rushing, both lingering in the comfortable silence that had become familiar. She spoke first, softly, about small regrets from her past, decisions she had wrestled with, opportunities she had missed. Her voice carried no bitterness, only a quiet honesty that invited trust. I listened, noticing how the light caught the edges of her hair, the way her hands moved gently as she gestured, unconsciously revealing her emotions. I realized that vulnerability was magnetic. Her openness drew me closer, making the tension from our previous encounters evolve into something deeper. "I think," she said, glancing at me from beneath her lashes, "that people are more complex than they let on. Sometimes it takes someone else noticing the quiet parts to make them feel understood." She paused, and I felt the weight of her words settle between us. I wanted to say something, to tell her I understood, but the words faltered. Instead, I reached out instinctively, brushing a strand of hair from her face, my fingers lingering lightly against her cheek. The warmth of that small contact seemed to echo her words: acknowledgement, comfort, care. She smiled faintly, and the atmosphere shifted. We continued walking, shoulders occasionally brushing, our proximity neither forced nor accidental. I realized I had stopped thinking about the age gap entirely. It had no bearing on the connection forming between us. What mattered was the ease, the honesty, and the quiet thrill of being noticed by someone who truly saw you. At one point, we sat on a low park bench beneath a lamppost, the evening light pooling around us. She spoke about the fear of judgment, the weight of expectations, and the longing for someone who could simply listen without offering advice, without trying to fix. I could feel her vulnerability, as tangibly as if I were holding it in my own hands. My own defenses softened, and I shared fragments of my story too, moments of uncertainty, feelings of inadequacy, the ways I had always insisted I was cold, when, in truth, I just hadn't found someone I could let warmth reach. We sat in companionable silence afterward, our hands almost touching on the bench. Every subtle brush, every shared glance carried more meaning than words could. The quiet intimacy of the moment was electrifying, not in a rush of passion, but in the profound recognition that we were both cautiously stepping into trust, into closeness, into something that might last. By the time we left the park, I knew the slow burn of our connection had grown stronger, more deliberate. The warmth I felt wasn't fleeting, it was rooted in understanding, acceptance, and a willingness to let vulnerability exist alongside desire. I couldn't predict what would come next, but I sensed that we were both ready to explore it, gently, carefully, and with hearts wide open. After that evening in the park, a subtle shift had settled between us, quiet, almost imperceptible to anyone watching, but impossible for either of us to ignore. Every encounter seemed to hum with anticipation, a silent language of proximity and glance that spoke louder than words ever could. I noticed it first in the way she held her coffee cup just slightly closer to her chest, as if bracing herself for the storm of emotions I was beginning to stir. We met at her favorite cafe again, a place that seemed to mirror her own warmth: soft lighting, the muted hum of conversation, the scent of roasted coffee beans mingling with a faint hint of vanilla. Sitting across from each other, I became acutely aware of every detail: the gentle curve of her shoulders, the small crease of her brow when she concentrated, the way her lips parted when she laughed. Each movement pulled me in, made my chest tighten in a mix of admiration and longing. Our hands brushed accidentally, a touch so casual, yet it lingered. I felt the warmth of her skin, the steady pulse of her heartbeat through her fingertips, and I had to consciously remind myself to breathe. She didn't pull away. Instead, her eyes flicked up to mine, holding a quiet intensity that left me both exhilarated and apprehensive. There was something in those glances, an unspoken confession, that neither of us dared voice yet. We spent hours talking, not about grand subjects but about the minutiae of our lives, favorite films, childhood memories, little annoyances that made us smile. And yet, each shared story became a thread, weaving us closer together. I caught myself leaning slightly forward, unconsciously seeking a little more proximity, a little more connection. She mirrored the gesture subtly, shoulders angling toward mine, eyes often meeting mine in a lingering gaze that felt both electric and safe. During a lull in the conversation, I noticed how her hair fell across her cheek, catching the light. I brushed it aside gently, my fingers lingering on her skin, feeling the warmth that contradicted every word I had ever said about being cold. She let the contact linger, her eyes softening in a way that made my heart ache with quiet longing. The moment was fleeting, yet it left a trace, a reminder that we were dancing on the edge of something neither of us could name but both felt deeply. Even when the cafe began to empty, we stayed, enveloped in a cocoon of quiet proximity. Our knees brushed, a small accidental contact, but neither moved away. Every gesture, every glance, every subtle touch was a confession, a promise, a question without words. The slow burn between us was no longer subtle. It simmered beneath the surface, contained only by our mutual hesitation and the understanding that some things required patience. By the time I left, I walked away with a strange mixture of frustration and exhilaration. Frustration that we hadn't yet acknowledged the unspoken, exhilaration that this tension, this silent desire, was growing stronger with each encounter. I knew one thing with certainty: whatever this was between us, it was only just beginning, and neither of us would be able to resist the pull for long. The evening had settled into a quiet intimacy, the kind that made the world outside fade into background noise. We found ourselves walking along a nearly empty street, the glow of street lamps reflecting off the wet pavement. The rain had stopped, leaving a faint mist in the air that made everything seem softer, dreamlike. I could feel the tension between us, the same quiet electricity that had grown steadily over our previous encounters, and I knew it could no longer remain unspoken. We paused at a small corner cafe that stayed open late. The lights inside were warm, golden, a stark contrast to the chill lingering in the air. I watched her as she adjusted her scarf, the light catching her hair, and felt a familiar tug in my chest. It was no longer just admiration or curiosity. It had deepened into something that demanded acknowledgement. I've been meaning to tell you something. I started, voice low, almost unsure. My hands fidgeted slightly, brushing against the mug I held. She looked up, her eyes soft but expectant, encouraging me without saying a word. That simple look, patient, gentle, accepting, gave me the courage to continue. I know I always joke about being cold, but it's not true, I confessed, feeling my own words sound foreign yet true. Being around you, it's different. You make me feel warmth I didn't know I needed. She smiled faintly, a mix of amusement and relief. I've felt it too, she admitted quietly, her voice carrying the same soft honesty that had drawn me in from the beginning. And I wasn't sure if I should say anything, but I can't ignore it anymore. Our hands found each other naturally, fingers interlacing in a tentative, deliberate way. The warmth from her skin spread through me, a steady reassurance that this connection was mutual. We sat across from each other in that small cafe booth, close enough for our shoulders to touch, the small contact grounding us in the moment. Each subtle gesture, a brush of fingers, a tilt of her head, a lingering look, conveyed what words could only partially capture. We laughed softly at little things, sharing private jokes that only the two of us understood, and the tension that had simmered for weeks dissolved into something tender and real. There was no need for grand declarations or dramatic gestures. Our intimacy lay in these small, deliberate choices, leaning closer when she spoke, letting our hands rest together on the table, sharing the warmth of our presence like a silent promise. As the night drew on, we stepped outside again. The city was quiet, and I could feel her hand in mine, the pressure gentle but insistent. The warmth between us was no longer just physical, it had settled deep, a sense of trust and understanding that made the cold of the world irrelevant. I realized, in that moment, that we had crossed the threshold from attraction to connection, a place where hesitation gave way to mutual recognition of what had been quietly growing all along. We parted that night with a lingering embrace, a hug that conveyed more than words ever could. My chest felt full, light, and restless all at once. The fire that had begun in fleeting touches, stolen glances, and subtle gestures had finally found its acknowledgement. And for the first time, I knew, without doubt, that this warmth wasn't fleeting, it was only just beginning. The morning sunlight spilled through the cafe windows, soft and golden, casting a gentle glow across the wooden tables. I arrived early, hoping to claim our usual corner, And as I waited, I realized how much these small routines had come to mean to me. Moments with her were no longer fleeting sparks but steady warmth, the kind that lingered even when she wasn't near. She arrived a few minutes later, her presence instantly brightening the space. Her hair caught the light, and her smile, quiet and knowing, made my chest swell in a way I hadn't anticipated. I waved, and she joined me, sliding into the seat across from me, brushing a finger against the edge of the table in a gesture so small, yet so intimate, it made my heartbeat quicken. The conversation flowed effortlessly, touching on trivialities and shared memories alike. There was laughter, teasing, and the comfortable silences that had become a language of their own. Every glance, every subtle lean, every brush of hands across the table carried the history of the moments we had shared, the rainy walks, the accidental touches, the quiet confessions. At one point, she reached across the table to adjust my scarf that had twisted slightly around my neck. Our fingers met, lingering in that soft touch, and I felt the familiar warmth rush through me. I didn't pull away, and neither did she. The gesture was simple, almost casual, yet it carried the weight of everything we had been building: trust, desire, patience, and understanding. After breakfast, we decided to take a walk through the nearby park. The air was crisp but not cold, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and damp earth. We walked side by side, shoulders occasionally brushing, hands close enough to touch but not quite yet intertwined. Each subtle contact was a reminder of how far we had come, from hesitant glances to the quiet acknowledgement of our feelings, the slow burn now fully realized. As we reached a bench under a large oak, we paused. She rested her hand lightly on my arm, the warmth of her skin seeping through the fabric, and I felt a calm certainty. I mirrored her gesture, our hands finally meeting in a gentle, deliberate hold. It wasn't dramatic or rushed, it was tender, steady, and safe. Our eyes met, and in that moment, everything unspoken between us found its voice, a quiet promise of companionship, respect, and enduring warmth. We sat there for a while, simply existing in each other's presence. I noticed the subtle curve of her smile, the way her gaze softened when she looked at me, the gentle rhythm of her breathing. Every small detail reassured me that what we had was real, lasting, and deeply felt. By the time we stood to leave, I felt a sense of contentment I hadn't known before. The fire that had sparked from fleeting touches, lingering glances, and hesitant confessions had matured into a steady, gentle warmth, a connection that neither coldness nor uncertainty could diminish. As we walked away, hands brushing and occasionally intertwining, I knew this was the start of something enduring, tender, and profoundly human. The age difference, the uncertainties, the quiet hesitations, they all felt irrelevant now. What mattered was the warmth we had discovered in each other, a warmth that could light even the coldest of hearts. And as we disappeared down the path, side by side, I knew that the story we had begun was finally, beautifully, ours.